This opening move establishes central control and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, preparing for rapid development and potential pawn breaks. This symmetrical response, 1. e5, immediately contests the center, establishing a classical foothold and preparing for rapid development of minor pieces, mirroring white's initiative. This move, 2. nf3, is a fundamental developing move that immediately attacks black's e5 pawn, forcing a response and dictating further development. This move develops a piece and controls central squares, preparing for further development and potentially leading to familiar opening structures like the Ruy-Lopez or Italian game. This move initiates the Ruy-Lopez, a cornerstone of chess opening theory, where white develops the bishop to pressure black's knight, indirectly threatening black's central pawn and preparing for central pawn advances. This move, known as the Morphy defense, challenges white's bishop, forcing it to decide whether to retreat or exchange, directly influencing the early pawn structure and piece activity. This move maintains the Ruy-Lopez opening's strategic tension by retreating the bishop rather than allowing it to be exchanged, preserving its influence on the long diagonal and keeping open the possibility of future central pawn advances for white. Black correctly challenges white's central pawn, developing a piece and preparing to castle kingside. Castling kingside consolidates white's king, brings the rook towards the center, and prepares for further development, a standard and solid move in the Ruy-Lopez. This move forces white's bishop to retreat, gaining tempo for black's queenside expansion within the Ruy-Lopez opening. This retreat maintains pressure on black's queenside pawn advances and prepares to recapture on c6. If black decides to capture the bishop, this move, b-flat7, is a standard developing move in the Ruy-Lopez, specifically the Morphy defense, effectively defending the pawn on e5 and preparing to challenge the bishop on b3. This move prepares to reinforce the e4 pawn and potentially develop the kingside pieces, maintaining central tension while awaiting black's further intentions in this Ruy-Lopez variation. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to challenge white's central control and potentially launch an attack against the king's side after white castles. This move solidifies white's center and prepares to develop the queen's knight, reinforcing control over the d4 square. This move solidifies the pawn center and prepares to develop the queen's bishop, a key piece in controlling the d6h2 diagonal. This move, 9. d4, initiates a central pawn break in the Ruy-Lopez, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and challenge black's pawn structure by creating imbalances. Black's bishop retreats to b6, maintaining its diagonal pressure while preparing to support a potential central pawn push or defend the kingside after white's central expansion. This move develops the bishop to an active square, aiming to control the center and potentially pin the knight, preparing for further central action. This move challenges white's attacking bishop, preventing it from establishing a strong pin on the f6 knight and allowing black to maintain a more flexible pawn structure. This move in the Ruy-Lopez, specifically the Botez-Kevitz variation, maintains pressure on the knight and prepares to challenge black's bishop if it retreats, while also safeguarding the bishop from potential future pawn advances. This move strategically reroutes the queen to a more active central square, supporting the central pawn push d5 and preparing to connect the rooks for future operations. This pawn thrust challenges black's queenside structure, aiming to gain space and potentially create weaknesses on the b5 square while opening lines for white's pieces. This move signals a strategic reversal, shifting the king to the queenside to mirror white's intention of a kingside attack and prepare for a pawn storm with c5. This capture opens the a file, creating immediate tension and offering an opportunity for white to challenge black's queenside pawn structure and potentially gain active piece play along the newly liberated file. This capture correctly recaptures the pawn, opening the a file and setting up potential counterplay for black against white's queenside initiative. This move, Na3, is a logical repositioning of the knight from the c3 square to the a3 square, aiming to support the upcoming b4 pawn push and potentially reinforce control over the queenside by preparing nb5 or nc4. Black's move 14, g5 aggressively challenges white's bishop on h4, aiming to disrupt white's kingside stability and potentially create queenside counterplay by opening lines for their pieces. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting the central tension while preparing for potential counterplay on the kingside. This move initiates a pawn exchange in the center, aiming to open lines and challenge black's central pawn presence while potentially creating weaknesses for white if the pawn structure becomes unbalanced. This move sacrifices the knight to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for attack after recapturing on d4. This move activates the rook on the e file, contesting the open file and preparing to potentially support a pawn advance or participate in kingside action. This recapture on d4 aims to neutralize black's central pawn majority and open lines for white's pieces while challenging black's king safety. This exchange of knights on d4 neutralizes white's attacking knight and opens the e file for black's rook, preparing to challenge white's central control and king safety. This exchange of knights aims to disrupt black's pawn structure, potentially opening lines for white's pieces while simplifying the position. This move, nxe4, initiates a sharp tactical sequence by striking at white's central pawn and offering a knight sacrifice to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for black's pieces. The recapture of the pawn on b5 with the bishop opens lines and increases the pressure on black's queenside pawn structure. This move, 19, c6, aims to bolster the pawn structure and potentially prepare for c5 to challenge white's central control, while also clearing the way for the queen to potentially maneuver. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, preparing to challenge black's control of the central dark squares and potentially support a kingside attack or central breakthrough. This move boldly challenges white's center, aiming to free black's pieces and potentially open lines for counterplay against the white king. This exchange simplifies the position by removing a knight, and white now has the opportunity to recapture with their bishop, opening the e file and maintaining pressure on black's central pawn structure after recapturing. This recapture of the bishop on e4 opens the e file for black's rook and challenges white's central pawn structure, creating dynamic tactical possibilities. This exchange of rooks simplifies the position while opening the e file for white's remaining rook, potentially leading to tactical opportunities against black's king. Black recaptures the bishop, simplifying the position and opening the d file for potential counterplay while maintaining an active rook on the e file. White activates the queen to eye the weak pawn on e4 and prepare for a central pawn push, potentially exploiting black's king position. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the f2 pawn and potentially preparing for a counterattack on the kingside as white's queen is somewhat exposed. The move qb4 is a dynamic repositioning of the queen, aiming to exploit the open A file and potentially create threats against black's king, while also defending against black's counterplay along the D file. This capture removes black's most active bishop, simplifying the position and opening the G file for potential white rooks while also opening a diagonal for black's queen. This move opens the H file, creating an attacking avenue against black's castled king and strengthening white's central control by eliminating black's dangerous bishop pair. This pawn thrust initiates a dangerous passed pawn that seeks to disrupt white's king safety and control key central squares. This pawn capture opens the F file for the rook and reinforces the central pawn structure, aiming to exploit the kingside weaknesses created by black's pawn push. The move 26. Re8 repositions the rook to an open file, preparing to challenge white's control and potentially create threats on the kingside after white's pawn capture on E4. This move repositions the knight to a more active square on B3, aiming to pressure the c-pawn and potentially attack the queenside pawns while also defending the important D4 square. The rook moves to the open E file, immediately contesting white's control and preparing to attack the weak pawns on the kingside. Should white's queen move, NC5 repositions the knight to a more active central outpost, eyeing the D7 pawn and potentially disrupting black's queen and rook coordination. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing the advanced E pawn and potentially preparing to support its advance or regroup for defense. This move activates the rook on the 7th rank, threatening to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create mating threats if the black king remains exposed.